Hello, everyone. My name is Donald Martin. I'm a technical program manager at Google. The title of my lightning talk is Causal Maps as Boundary Objects for Understanding AI Development Territories. I want to start with a high-level assertion that to navigate the perils and promises of AI together, the tech and stakeholder communities need shared understandings of their respective causal theories about how the world works. Now, to navigate together requires a map. And a map is the quintessential boundary object as described in the seminal work by Starr and Grissomer about boundary objects. In it, they state that in natural history work, boundary objects are produced when sponsors, theorists, and amateurs collaborate to produce representations of nature. Among these objects are specimens, field notes, museums, and maps of particular territories. So, what might be the territories of AI development? To explore that, let's look at an example of a major failure of an AI system. Many of you are familiar with the recently discovered racial bias in a medical algorithm that is widely used throughout the US healthcare system. The purpose of the system that the algorithm was a part of was to identify patients with the most complex healthcare needs. The idea being that this would reduce the overall cost in the healthcare system. Unfortunately, people not selected for the special programs by the algorithm suffered from nearly 50,000 more chronic diseases than those selected. And the people not selected were disproportionately Black Americans. So, how did this happen? The researchers who studied the algorithm and how it was created identified that the root cause of this failure was the target variable selection decision that took place during problem formulation. Now, let's explore how these kind of decisions are made to introduce this concept of AI development territories. Now, problem formulation happens within what we're calling Territory 1. And within Territory 1, finance, sales, marketing, and product management people are making critical decisions about which problems to focus on, what the key factors of those problems are, and who the impacted stakeholders are. Decisions made in Territory 1 can have a significant impact on decisions made in Territory 2. In Territory 2, you have software engineers and data scientists making critical decisions about data selection, model design, and training and testing. Territory 2 actually creates the main artifact we talk about in AI, which is the model or algorithm. And when we work on mitigating bias in machine learning, we typically spend most of our time focusing on Territory 2. But as we discovered when we examined the racially biased medical algorithm, the origins of that bias actually took place in Territory 1. So when we overly focus on Territory 2 at the expense of examining Territory 1, it can lead to us missing critical sources of bias that can have devastating downstream impacts. Now, mentioning devastating downstream impacts brings us to Territory 3. Territory 3 is civil society, which suffers from the negative impacts of machine learning models when they exhibit bias. Territory 3 consists of citizens and policymakers and competitors and communities who are also making critical decisions about which problems they want to focus on, what the critical factors of those problems are, who the impacted stakeholders are, and what they're going to do to design and implement solutions to those problems. Now, I've talked a lot about decision making because decision making is the main activity that takes place in these territories. And as humans, we use our causal inference capabilities to make decisions. Those causal inferences are shaped by strong top-down prior knowledge in the form of intuitive theories. We call those intuitive theories causal theories, and we develop those over time as we gain experience navigating complex realities. Now, when we look at our territories of ML and AI development, realize that the key features of these territories are many different, independent, unique models and causal theories that key decision makers hold about the world and how it works. Now, each of these territories is like an independent island filled with many different conceptions of the problems to solve in the world and what the possible solutions might be to those problems. Now, there's not very much interaction or mutual awareness between these three territories, and that really lacks during the product development process. So it's not hard to understand why there can be mismatches in expectations and problem understanding that lead to harmful outcomes as a result of machine learning and AI development. Now, let's take a closer look at what happened with the racially biased medical algorithm to drive home the point that there's a need to work on the problem of limited interaction and mutual awareness between these territories. Now, as a reminder, the problem that the designers and product managers were tasked with solving for this particular algorithm, the medical algorithm, was to select patients with the most complex healthcare needs for special programs. And within Territory 1, they formulated the causal theory that patients with the most complex healthcare needs would have spent more money on healthcare in the past. And this led them to select spending on healthcare as the target variable for the algorithm. Now, we know this was problematic and it led to racial bias in the algorithm. But why did that happen? That happened because this causal theory excludes critical factors that impact how much Black Americans spend on healthcare independent of healthcare need. These are factors such as underdiagnosis due to bias, lack of trust in the healthcare system, wealth and income disparities, and lack of access to affordable healthcare. These same factors taken together also lead to increased instances of complex healthcare needs in the Black American community, while simultaneously decreasing how much they spend on healthcare. So there's a big disconnect between the conception of the problem in these two territories. And so this points out the need to bridge the gap between these two territories in terms of how they conceive the problem. There's a need for a boundary object to help do that. So our recommended solution is to introduce formal and explicit boundary object creation processes and methods to map these territories during the earliest stages of the traditional product development process. Now, these processes should be optimized to elicit, synthesize, and make explicit the causal theories of target and non-target stakeholders in these three territories. They should center the perspectives of the communities most vulnerable to algorithmic bias in participatory and non-extractive ways. And finally, they need to be able to contend with the dynamically complex nature of the societal context in which products will be deployed. Now, we've identified community-based system dynamics as a promising practice to operationalize these new methods. And we focused on that because the construction of boundary objects is central to the practice of community-based system dynamics. It's not an add-on. This is made clear based on this quote from the book, Community-Based System Dynamics. It states that the use of informal causal maps and formal models that can be simulated in system dynamics within a group model building session provides a systematic way to negotiate and socially construct a series of boundary objects. Now, we've been spending some time practicing system dynamics with stakeholders, and we introduced them to two main ways to represent causal theories using causal maps. The first is a causal loop diagram representation on the left-hand side. That allows you to express factors or problems and how they're related. I can't go into details about the notations, but that's one key representation for causal maps. The second is a stock and flow representation. This particular representation is optimized to be able to quantify the factors that are present in causal maps so that you can simulate them and gain a deeper understanding. Now, just to demonstrate that people can pick up the techniques for drawing these causal maps pretty quickly, I want to show you what it looks like in practice for people to do this work with a couple of photos. These folks are actually developing a boundary object about wealth and income disparities after only an hour and a half of introduction to the techniques. This is what it looks like in practice as well in terms of the sorts of boundary objects that are generated. These are key artifacts that help people gain a shared understanding of a complex problem. Finally, you can use software also to represent these causal maps to set them up for simulation. And there's also these software-based causal maps also serve as powerful boundary objects. So our next steps to kind of pursue this path of creating boundary objects and causal maps for bridging the gap between the territories of AI development are to, one, test the efficacy of CBSD in product development so we can identify the constraints of practicing CBSD in corporate environments in partnership with the communities. And then finally, most importantly, we want to focus on what it takes to build capacity within communities to fully participate and lead, because communities are typically the most vulnerable to the negative impacts of biased algorithms. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the discussion that we'll have in the panel.